Hi, Dan Sussman here, and in this presentation we're going to talk about relative clauses, what they are, how you use them, and how they can improve your writing. First of all, we need to ask what a relative clause is. A relative clause, first of all, is also known as an adjective clause. If you hear people talking about adjective clauses and then maybe start talking about relative clauses, they are talking about the same thing. It's a different name for the same concept. And a relative clause, to be a relative clause, has to meet three requirements. First of all, like any clause, it has to contain a subject and a verb. And relative clauses generally begin with relative pronouns. Who, whom, whose, that, which. They can also begin with relative adverbs such as when and where. And the clause functions as an adjective by answering these kinds of questions. What kind? How many? Which one? Okay, as a warm-up here, I should say that there are basically two patterns for writing relative clauses. And don't worry if this all seems a little bit abstract, because I'm going to show you examples right away. The first pattern, the relative clause starts with a relative pronoun or adverb, then adds the subject, then adds the verb. In the second pattern, we start with a relative pronoun which acts as the subject of the sentence and then goes to the verb. So really the only difference is that the relative pronoun or adverb that starts pattern 1 is not the subject, and in pattern 2 it is the subject. So let's see what all of this looks like in real life. First of all, pattern 1. The argument which Francine did not accept was poorly worded. Okay. First of all, we have the relative clause itself, which Francine did not accept. And please note, it starts with one of those relative pronouns, which. Okay. Then we're looking for the subject of the clause, because remember, like every other clause, I said relative clauses have a subject and a verb. So the subject in this case is Francine, and the verb is accept. Let's see another example. The store where George found the rare book is in the old building. Okay, there is our relative clause, where George found the rare book. It starts with a relative pronoun or adverb, goes on to the subject, and then found the verb. And of course, the rare book is the object in this clause, but we're not even going to get into that. It's not important for our purposes right now. And let's take a look at what the relative clause is describing. Where George found the rare book. Where? So the clause answers the question where, and it refers back to the store. Which store? The store where George found the rare book. Okay, let's look at pattern 2 now. And in pattern 2, we said the relative pronoun acts as the subject of the clause and is then followed by the verb. So here we have a sentence: Jorge, who plays video games too much, does not get enough sleep. First of all, here's our relative clause. Who plays video games too much? It answers the question who? Well, it refers back to Jorge. It tells us a little more about Jorge. And we have the relative pronoun, who. Who is also the subject of the clause, and the verb is plays. The dog that ate the chocolate bar got very sick. First, our relative clause, and remember, we're going to be looking for a relative pronoun that starts it out. And there it is, that. And in this case, that also serves as the subject of the for the verb ate. And the whole clause, that ate the chocolate bar. Which dog? The dog that ate the chocolate bar. That ate the chocolate bar is referring back to dog and tells us which dog we're talking about. Okay, so here are some things to remember. First of all, relative clauses are not independent clauses. You may remember that an independent clause has a subject and a verb like every clause, but it also forms a complete thought, meaning it could stand on its own as a sentence. Relative clauses do not, and so to avoid writing a fragment, you have to connect each relative clause to a main clause, and that forms what we call a complex sentence. So here are a couple of examples. Joey offered an apology which Francine did not accept. All right, let's take the relative clause, which Francine did not accept. That could not stand on its own as a sentence. It's got a subject, Francine, it's got a verb, accept, but it is not a complete thought. It has to be attached to the main clause. Joey offered an apology, which in fact is an independent clause. Put them together and you have a complex sentence. Let's look at the next one. Michelle screamed when she saw the spider that dangled from the one clean bathroom towel. Okay, the relative clause, that dangled from the one clean bathroom towel. It's describing the spider. It's telling us which spider. Which one? Oh, the one that dangled from the towel. But that relative clause cannot stand on its own as a sentence. It has a subject, it has a verb, but it does not make a complete thought. It can be attached, however, to the main clause. Michelle screamed when she saw the spider, which is an independent clause. It could stand by itself as a sentence. And so what we have there is a complex sentence containing a relative clause. Something else to remember. A relative clause should be placed directly after the word it modifies. Let's look at this one. A girl sat beside me on the bus that looks like my cousin. Well, either it's a very attractive bus or it's a very funny-looking cousin, but what that sentence says is that the bus looks like my cousin. I suspect that's not what you're trying to say. What you are trying to say, however, is a girl that looks exactly like my cousin sat beside me on the bus. This is the correct way to write that sentence because the relative clause is placed right next to the thing that it describes, which is girl. Here's another example. The dog belongs to our neighbor that has such an annoying bark. Well, does your neighbor bark? He or she must, because that's what that sentence says. The relative clause is right next to the word neighbor. What you really want to say, of course, is the dog that has such an annoying bark belongs to our neighbor. The relative clause there is next to the thing it describes, which is dog. Now, these may sound like slightly silly examples that anybody would understand, but believe me, there are many cases where you can cause a lot of justifiable confusion by putting the relative clause in the wrong place. So make sure that you put it in the right place, right after the noun or the pronoun that it is describing. All right, let's try a few examples. People who live in cities have more stress than people who live in the country. Okay, there are actually two relative clauses here. Can you spot them? Well, here they are. People who live in cities. Who live in cities? Which people? The people who live in cities have more stress than people who live in the country. Now, we have two different sets of people, so we have two adjective clauses that describe them in the sentence. New Yorkers who seldom visit Times Square often go to museums. What's the relative clause there? Well, the relative clause is who seldom visit Times Square. It starts with a relative pronoun, and it answers the question, which New Yorkers? Oh, the New Yorkers who seldom visit Times Square. Now I know which ones you're talking about. Hawaii, which is located in the Pacific Ocean, is composed of numerous islands. Hawaii, which is located in the Pacific Ocean, starts with the relative pronoun which, and the whole clause tells us about Hawaii. It gives us more information about Hawaii. Okay, now it's time to talk about something that proves a little bit tricky for new speakers of the English language, and truth be told, it also poses problems for people who have been speaking and writing the English language for a long time, but we're going to try to work through it. We are going to talk about essential versus non-essential relative clauses, and the word essential, by the way, means necessary. So we're really saying necessary versus non-necessary relative clauses. You may also see this written as definitive versus non-definitive relative clauses. Means the same thing. But let's use this terminology for now. Essential relative clauses contain information that is essential or necessary to the meaning of the sentence. If it wasn't there, the meaning of the sentence would either be unclear or be changed altogether. So let's look at this example. The man who wore the long scarf played the trumpet beautifully. Okay, which man? The man who wore the long scarf. If that relative clause, who wore the long scarf, was not there, you would not know which man we were talking about. So that is an essential relative clause. Freddie hopes to return to the city where he met a woman with beautiful green eyes. Okay, Freddie hopes to return to the city. Well, which city? If that's all it said, I wouldn't know what we're talking about. The city where he met a woman with beautiful green eyes. Oh, okay, that tells me which city. That is essential to the meaning of this sentence. Now, we know what an essential relative clause is, so it figures that a non-essential relative clause adds information to the sentence. Oh, it does. It enriches the sentence. But that information is not essential to the meaning of the sentence. In other words, if we took it out, the meaning of the sentence really would not change, or it wouldn't be any less clear. All this is supplementary information. So let's take the example. The roller coaster at the amusement park, which is the tallest attraction, was thrilling to ride. Okay, the relative clause is which is the tallest attraction. If we took that out of the sentence and it just said, the roller coaster at the amusement park was thrilling to ride, the meaning of the sentence would not change or not be unclear. It just provides additional information. That's what a non-essential relative clause is. So, what's all this got to do with anything? Well, it has to do with the way that you punctuate that relative clause. If the relative clause is essential, if it has to be there for the sentence to make sense, we do not use commas. We do not set it off with commas. So, the boy who cried wolf eventually was ignored by the people in his town. If I just said the boy eventually was ignored by the people in his town, you would not know which boy we are talking about. But with the relative clause who cried wolf there, oh, that boy, okay. That is an essential clause, so we have no commas surrounding it. The team that wore the blue uniforms won the baseball, I should say baseball game. It says baseball team there. Which team won the game? Oh, the one that wore the blue uniforms. If it wasn't there, if it just said the team won the baseball game, you would not know which team we are talking about. That's an essential clause. No commas surrounding it. But if the relative clause is not essential, if it is not absolutely necessary to the meaning of the sentence, we set it off with commas. The dog, which had just finished its meal, growled at the mailman. Okay. The dog growled at the mailman. That's the main thought in this sentence. The fact that it had just finished its meal, well, that's interesting, and it tells us a little bit more about the dog, but it really does not affect the meaning of the sentence. It's just some additional information. We set it off from the rest of the sentence with commas. My brother, who managed to get excellent grades in high school, will go to college next year. Okay. Who managed to get excellent grades in high school? That's a nice piece of information to know, but if the sentence just said, my brother will go to college next year, the meaning isn't changed. The relative clause just adds additional information, so we set it off with commas. One more thing I'd like you to know. Non-essential relative clauses never begin with the word that. So we do not say the dog that had just finished eating growled at the mailman. However, we do say the dog which had just finished eating growled at the mailman. New York, that is the biggest city in the United States, is very exciting. No, we do not say that. We say New York, which is the biggest city in the United States, is very exciting. So, if you are using a non-essential relative clause, we do not start it with that. It will be which or who usually.